I never thought a simple walk in my own backyard would end in heartbreak. One morning, I found my beloved pet lifeless, just steps from my porch, gone because of a decision made by the very people meant to protect our community. The HOA claimed it was just enforcing the rules. But what happened next tore the neighborhood apart. As neighbors took sides and secrets surfaced, I realized this was about more than just a pet. It was about power, control, and the lengths some people will go to. How far would you go if the people in charge destroyed what you loved most? Before everything changed, my life in Willow Creek felt almost picture perfect. I moved here with my husband and our golden retriever, Daisy, after years of saving and dreaming about a place to finally call home. Willow Creek was the kind of neighborhood that looked like it belonged on a postcard. Neatly trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes on quiet streets, and neighbors who waved as you passed by. The houses all looked similar, but each one had its own little touch. A bright door, a flower bed, a wind chime. It was peaceful, predictable, and for a while I thought it was safe. Our house sat on a corner lot with a backyard that Daisy loved to explore. Every morning, I'd sip my coffee on the porch while she chased squirrels and sniffed at the garden beds. The air always smelled faintly of cut grass and blooming jasmine. I'd watch the sun rise over the rooftops, feeling grateful for the calm and the sense of belonging. We'd only been here a year, but it already felt like home. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association was always present, but in the background, like a distant hum, they sent out monthly newsletters about community events, reminders to keep trash bins out of sight, and the occasional warning about parking violations. I never paid much attention. I followed the rules, kept my yard tidy, and tried to be a good neighbor. I thought that was enough. There were a few faces in the neighborhood who stood out. Mrs. Langley, the HOA president, was one of them. She was always impeccably dressed, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning every property as she walked her little dog, Muffin. She had a reputation for being strict, but I figured she was just passionate about keeping the neighborhood nice. I'd see her at the mailbox or at the annual block party, always polite but never quite warm. Most of my interactions with neighbors were friendly but brief. We'd chat about the weather, swap gardening tips, or share a laugh about the latest squirrel antics. There was a sense of order here, a quiet understanding that everyone did their part to keep things running smoothly. I liked that. It made me feel secure. But there were hints, even in those early days, that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. I'd overhear whispers about fines for unauthorized holiday decorations, or see a neighbor quietly repainting their fence after a warning letter. Once, I noticed a family packing up a moving truck in the middle of the night, their faces tense and tired. I wondered what had happened, but I never asked. Still, I brushed off those moments. I told myself every community had its quirks, and that the rules were there for a reason. I was careful to keep Daisy on a leash, to pick up after her, and to make sure our yard was always neat. I wanted to fit in, to be part of the neighborhood, to avoid trouble. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. I didn't see the warning signs, the subtle ways the HOA's power crept into every corner of our lives. I didn't notice how quickly a friendly wave could turn into a cold shoulder, or how a simple complaint could spiral into something much bigger. I thought I was safe because I followed the rules. But all it took was one small change, one new rule, quietly slipped into the latest newsletter, to set everything in motion. A rule that seemed harmless at first, but would soon turn my world upside down. I had no idea that the place I loved most would become the setting for my worst nightmare, and that the people I trusted to protect our community would be the ones to tear it apart. It started with a letter, not the friendly kind, but the kind that arrives in a plain white envelope, stamped with the HOA's logo and a warning. In bold red letters, immediate attention required. I remember the way my hands shook as I opened it, the pit in my stomach growing with every word. The letter was about Daisy. According to the HOA, she was frequently observed off-leash in our own backyard, and this was a violation of a new rule, one I hadn't even noticed in the last newsletter. The rule was simple but strict. All pets, even in fenced yards, must be leashed at all times when outdoors. The justification was vague. Something about community safety and preventing disturbances. I reread the letter, my mind racing. Daisy had never left our yard. She was gentle, never barked at anyone, and loved nothing more than sunbathing in the grass. The idea that she was a threat to anyone was absurd. I tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had seen her through the fence and assumed she was loose. I decided to call the HOA office, hoping for a quick resolution. The woman on the phone was polite but firm. The rule was non-negotiable, she said. If I was seen with Daisy off-leash again, I'd face a fine. I hung up, frustrated but determined to comply. I bought a long leash and clipped it to Daisy's collar every time she went outside. even though it felt ridiculous. But the letters kept coming, each one more severe than the last. Second notice, violation of pet policy. Final warning, non-compliance will result in fines. I started to feel watched. Every time I stepped outside, I'd catch a glimpse of Mrs. Langley walking by, her eyes lingering on our yard just a little too long. Sometimes I'd see her jotting something down on her clipboard, her lips pressed into a thin line. The fine started small, $50, then $100, then $250. I tried to fight them, sending emails and photos showing Daisy on her leash. But the HOA insisted I was in violation. They claimed to have multiple eyewitness reports and photographic evidence, but never showed me any proof. The stress began to seep into every part of my life. I stopped enjoying my morning coffee on the porch. I started avoiding neighbors, afraid of who might be reporting me. One afternoon, I found a note taped to my door. It wasn't from the HOA, but from a neighbor. The handwriting was shaky, the message short. Some of us are on your side. Be careful who you trust. My heart pounded as I read it. Was someone watching out for me, or was this another warning? I felt more alone than ever. The next week, the HOA announced a new initiative, random property inspections. They claimed it was to maintain community standards, but it felt like a targeted attack. Inspectors would walk through the neighborhood, peering over fences, taking notes, and snapping photos. I watched from my window as they moved from house to house, their faces expressionless. When they reached my yard, Daisy barked once, her tail wagging. The inspector glared at her, scribbled something on his clipboard, and moved on. That night, I received another letter. This time, the HOA accused me of creating a public nuisance and failing to control a dangerous animal. The words stung. Daisy was the gentlest soul I'd ever known. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't remedy the situation immediately. I felt trapped, powerless against a system that seemed determined to make me an example. I tried to rally support from my neighbors, but most were too afraid to get involved. A few offered quiet words of encouragement, but no one wanted to risk the HOA's wrath. I started to notice subtle changes. People who used to wave now avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I walked by, and children who once played with Daisy were suddenly kept away. The isolation was suffocating. Desperate, I attended the next HOA meeting, hoping to plead my case. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Mrs. Langley sat at the front, her expression unreadable. I spoke about Daisy, about the unfairness of the rule, about the lack of evidence. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, some sympathetic, others cold. When I finished, Mrs. Langley simply thanked me for my input and moved on to the next agenda item. My words had fallen on deaf ears. The fines continued to pile up. The HOA threatened to place a lien on our home if we didn't pay. My husband and I argued late into the night, the stress wearing us down. I started to dread coming home, afraid of what new letter or threat might be waiting. Daisy sensed my anxiety, her once bright eyes now clouded with confusion. Then, one morning, everything changed. I woke to find our backyard gate wide open. Daisy was gone. Panic surged through me as I searched the neighborhood, calling her name. Hours later, a neighbor found her. She'd been hit by a car on the main road. The grief was overwhelming. I blamed myself, but deep down, I knew this was no accident. Someone had opened that gate. Someone wanted to hurt us. The HOA sent a letter of condolence, but it felt hollow. They reminded me that all pets must be secured at all times, and that failure to comply with community standards can have tragic consequences. The implication was clear, this was my fault. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly what they wanted. In the days that followed, the neighborhood erupted. Some neighbors were outraged, blaming the HOA for pushing things too far. Others sided with the rules, insisting that order must be maintained. The community was divided, old friendships shattered by suspicion and fear. I received anonymous notes of support, but also threats. Someone spray-painted "rule breaker" on our fence. Another left a dead bird on our porch. I started documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every threat. I reached out to local news stations, hoping to shine a light on what was happening. A reporter agreed to meet with me, and soon our story was on the evening news. The backlash was immediate. The HOA claimed I was misrepresenting the facts and inciting unrest. Mrs. Langley called an emergency meeting, urging the community to stand together against those who would undermine our values. But the tide was turning. More neighbors began to speak out, sharing their own stories of harassment and unfair treatment. A petition circulated, demanding an investigation into the HOA's practices. The board tried to silence dissent, threatening legal action against anyone who spoke to the media. The atmosphere in Willow Creek grew tense, every interaction charged with suspicion. One night, I found a stack of HOA documents slipped under my door. They were anonymous but detailed, records of fines, complaints, and internal emails. The documents revealed a pattern of targeting certain homeowners, especially those who questioned the rules. There were notes about making examples of rule breakers, and even discussions about Daisy. My heart pounded as I read the words, "If she won't comply, we'll have to escalate." Armed with this evidence, I contacted a lawyer. The case quickly gained traction, drawing attention from advocacy groups and local officials. The HOA doubled down, insisting they were within their rights. But cracks were beginning to show. Mrs. Langley's once unshakable authority was now under scrutiny. Rumors swirled about her personal vendettas and misuse of power. The community was at a breaking point. Some neighbors rallied around me, organizing protests and demanding change. Others dug in their heels, convinced that any challenge to the HOA was a threat to their way of life. The tension was palpable. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, never knowing who was friend or foe. As the legal battle loomed, I found myself at the center of a storm I never saw coming. The grief of losing Daisy was still raw, but now it was mixed with a fierce determination. I refused to let her death be in vain. I would fight, not just for myself, but for everyone who had been silenced or bullied by those in power. But just as it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, a new twist emerged, one that would change everything. A neighbor came forward with a secret that threatened to unravel the entire HOA from the inside. The truth was more shocking than I could have imagined, and it was about to turn the battle for Willow Creek upside down. The day of the emergency HOA meeting arrived with a heaviness that pressed down on the entire neighborhood. For weeks, tension had simmered just beneath the surface of Willow Creek, but now it was boiling over. The clubhouse parking lot overflowed with cars, and people gathered in tight, anxious clusters, their voices low and urgent. I could feel the eyes on me as I walked in, clutching the folder of evidence that had become my lifeline. Some faces were sympathetic, others cold and accusing. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that tonight something irreversible would happen. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, their expressions carefully neutral. Mrs. Langley, as always, presided from the center, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the crowd with a practiced calm. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, a crack in the armor that had once seemed impenetrable. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but the tension was palpable. When Mrs. Langley opened the floor for community concerns, I stood up, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own voice. I spoke not just for myself, but for every neighbor who had been silenced, fined, or threatened. I described the relentless harassment, the escalating fines, the anonymous threats, and, most painfully, the loss of Daisy. I held up the stack of letters, the photos, the notes slipped under my door. I read aloud from the internal HOA documents, my voice trembling with anger and grief. As I spoke, the room shifted. People who had once avoided my gaze now looked at me with something like recognition, maybe even guilt. I could see neighbors nodding, some wiping away tears. Others sat stone-faced, unwilling to let go of their certainty that the rules were all that mattered. But the silence was different now. It was the silence of people listening, really listening, for the first time. Then, just as I finished, a voice from the back of the room broke the tension. It was Mr. Patel, a quiet man who had lived in Willow Creek for years. He stood and with a shaking hand held up his own stack of letters. He spoke about the fines he'd received for improper landscaping, the threats of legal action, the fear that had crept into his home. One by one, others followed. Mrs. Rivera, the single mother fined for her son's bicycle left on the lawn. The elderly couple who had been threatened with eviction over a garden gnome. The stories poured out, each one a piece of a puzzle that revealed the true face of the HOA's power. Mrs. Langley tried to regain control, her voice sharp and commanding. She insisted that the rules were clear, that the board was only doing its duty, that any unfortunate incidents were the result of non-compliance. But the room was no longer with her. The board members shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging nervous glances. The carefully constructed order of Willow Creek was unraveling, and everyone could feel it. Then came the moment that changed everything. The neighbor who had slipped the documents under my door, Sarah, a former board member, stood up. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she revealed what she knew. She spoke of secret meetings, of decisions made behind closed doors, of a deliberate campaign to target problem homeowners. She described how Mrs. Langley had manipulated the board, using fear and intimidation to silence dissent. She read from emails that made it clear Daisy's death was not just a tragic accident, but the result of a calculated effort to make an example of me. The room erupted. Some people shouted in anger, others wept openly. The board members looked stunned. Their composure shattered. Mrs. Langley's face went pale. Her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. For a moment she tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The power she had wielded so effortlessly was slipping away, replaced by a wave of outrage and betrayal. At that moment, my lawyer, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. He announced that a formal complaint had been filed with the state's Department of Consumer Affairs, and that a class action lawsuit was being prepared on behalf of the affected homeowners. The evidence was overwhelming: patterns of harassment, abuse of power, and even potential criminal negligence. The board would be held accountable, not just in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Some neighbors cheered, others argued, but the spell of fear had been broken. People who had once been silent now found their voices, demanding answers, demanding justice. The board members, realizing the tide had turned, began to distance themselves from Mrs. Langley, some even resigning on the spot. The once unshakable leader of Willow Creek now looked small and defeated, her authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. But the most powerful moment came when I stood, holding Daisy's collar in my hand. I spoke not of rules or fines, but of the simple joy she had brought to my life, and the pain of losing her to a system that valued control over compassion. I asked the room to remember what it meant to be a community, not just a collection of houses, but a place where people looked out for one another, where kindness mattered more than conformity. As I finished, the room fell silent. For the first time, I felt the weight of my grief lift, replaced by something stronger, a sense of hope, of possibility. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. Neighbors gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices, some offering hugs, others simply standing together in solidarity. The clubhouse, once a symbol of the HOA's power, now felt different, less imposing, more human. But as I walked home, I knew the fight was not yet finished. The lawsuit would take time, and the wounds in the community would not heal overnight. There would be more challenges, more battles to fight. But for the first time, I felt ready. I was no longer alone. And as I reached my front door, I paused, looking back at the clubhouse, now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The neighborhood would never be the same. But maybe, just maybe, it could become something better. The next morning, a new letter arrived, this time, not from the HOA, but from a neighbor. It was a simple note, handwritten and heartfelt. Thank you for standing up for all of us. We're with you. The war for Willow Creek was far from over, but the first battle had been won. And as the sun rose over the rooftops, I realized that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward, if you have the courage to fight for it. In the days and weeks that followed the explosive HOA meeting, Willow Creek felt like a neighborhood waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The air was different, charged with possibility, but also heavy with the knowledge of what had been allowed to happen for so long. The clubhouse, once a fortress of authority, now stood as a reminder of the night everything changed. The board was in shambles, with several members resigning in the aftermath, and Mrs. Langley herself was nowhere to be seen. Her once daily walks with Muffin had stopped, and her house, with its perfectly manicured lawn, now seemed strangely silent and empty. The lawsuit moved forward, gathering momentum as more residents came forward with their own stories. The local news coverage had drawn attention from advocacy groups and even state officials, who began investigating the HOA's practices. For the first time, the board was forced to answer questions, not just from angry homeowners, but from people with the power to hold them accountable. The threat of legal action hung over the community, but for many, it was a relief. It meant that the days of unchecked power and secret punishments were finally coming to an end. For me, the aftermath was a strange mix of relief, exhaustion, and lingering grief. Daisy's absence was a constant ache, a reminder of what had been lost in the fight for justice. I found myself reaching for her leash in the mornings, expecting to see her waiting by the door, tail wagging. The house felt emptier, quieter, but also safer. The fear that had once crept into every corner was gone, replaced by a cautious hope. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now reached out, some with apologies, others with gratitude. I received cards, flowers, and even homemade meals from people I barely knew. The simple act of sharing my story had broken the silence that had kept so many isolated and afraid. People began to talk openly about their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes for the future. The sense of community that had been missing for so long was slowly returning, built not on fear but on shared understanding and support. The board, under pressure from both residents and outside authorities, was forced to make sweeping changes. The most egregious rules were repealed, and a new, more transparent process for creating and enforcing policies was put in place. Residents were invited to participate in open forums, where their voices could be heard and their concerns addressed. The days of secret meetings and anonymous fines were over. The HOA, once a symbol of control and intimidation, was being transformed into something more accountable and humane. Mrs. Langley, facing mounting legal and social pressure, eventually resigned as president. Her departure was quiet, almost anticlimactic, but it marked the end of an era. In her place, a new board was elected, one made up of residents who had experienced the worst of the old regime and were determined to do better. They promised transparency, fairness, and a renewed focus on building a true sense of community. It was a promise that would take time to fulfill, but for the first time, it felt possible. The lawsuit itself became a rallying point, not just for Willow Creek, but for other neighborhoods facing similar struggles. Our story was shared online, in newspapers, and on local television. People from across the state reached out, sharing their own experiences with abusive HOAs and offering support. Advocacy groups used our case as an example, pushing for legislative changes to protect homeowners from unchecked HOA power. What had started as a personal tragedy had become a catalyst for change, far beyond our little corner of the world. For me, the healing process was slow. I spent long hours in the backyard, tending to the garden Daisy had loved so much. I planted a tree in her memory, a living reminder of her gentle spirit and the fight that had been waged in her name. Neighbors helped, some bringing plants or simply offering a kind word. The act of creating something new, of nurturing life where there had been so much pain, was a small but important step toward moving forward. The community too began to heal. Old divisions lingered, but there was a new willingness to listen, to forgive and to rebuild. Block parties returned, this time with a sense of genuine camaraderie. Children played together in the streets, their laughter a welcome sound after months of tension and fear. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other with warmth, united by the shared experience of standing up to injustice. The new board made good on its promises, holding regular meetings that were open and accessible to all. Residents were encouraged to participate, to ask questions, and to hold their leaders accountable. The rules were rewritten, this time with input from the entire community. Gone were the draconian fines and arbitrary restrictions. In their place were guidelines that balanced order with compassion, designed to protect everyone's rights without sacrificing kindness or common sense. Looking back, it was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. The fear and isolation that had once defined Willow Creek were gone, replaced by a sense of empowerment and hope. People who had once felt powerless now knew that their voices mattered, that they could make a difference. The scars of the past remained, but they were a reminder of what had been overcome, and of the strength that had been found in the face of adversity. As for Mrs. Langley, her departure from the board did not mean the end of her influence. For a time she remained in the neighborhood, but her presence was diminished. Some neighbors avoided her, others tried to reach out, but she kept to herself. Eventually, she put her house up for sale and moved away, leaving behind a legacy that would not soon be forgotten. Her name became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when power is left unchecked, and of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult. The impact of what happened in Willow Creek rippled outward, touching lives far beyond our own. Other neighborhoods began to question their own HOAs, to demand transparency and accountability. Lawmakers took notice, introducing new regulations to protect homeowners from abuse. Advocacy groups used our story to educate and empower others, ensuring that what happened to Daisy and to so many others would not be repeated. For me, the journey was transformative. I had never seen myself as a fighter, but the loss of Daisy and the injustice that followed had awakened something in me. I learned the power of community, the importance of speaking out, and the strength that comes from standing together. I found allies in unexpected places and discovered that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. The tree I planted for Daisy grew quickly, its branches reaching toward the sky. It became a gathering place for neighbors, a symbol of resilience and renewal. On the anniversary of her passing, we held a small ceremony, inviting everyone to share memories and plant flowers around the base of the tree. It was a moment of healing, a chance to honor not just Daisy, but the spirit of community that had been reborn in her memory. As the seasons changed, so did Willow Creek. The neighborhood was not perfect. No place ever is, but it was stronger, wiser, and more united than before. The lessons learned in the wake of tragedy had become the foundation for something better. People looked out for one another, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The rules were still there, but they served the people, not the other way around. In the end, the fight for justice was about more than one pet, one family, or even one neighborhood. It was about the right to live in peace, to be treated with dignity, and to have a voice in the place you call home. It was about the power of ordinary people to stand up to injustice, to demand better, and to create change. As I sit on my porch watching the sun set over Willow Creek, I think about all that has happened. I think about Daisy, about the friends I have made, and about the community we have built together. I know that there will always be challenges, always be those who seek to control or divide. But I also know that we are stronger than we think, and that together we can overcome anything. So I ask you, what would you do if the people in charge destroyed what you loved most? Would you stay silent, or would you find the courage to fight back? Because sometimes the smallest voices can spark the biggest changes. And sometimes the greatest strength is found in standing together, even when the odds seem impossible. That is the legacy of Daisy and of Willow Creek, a reminder that even in the face of loss, there is always hope, and that the fight for justice is never truly over.